Hey, YouTube, how is it going? I hope all is well. Today, as you can probably see, we have a new build starting, and I figured it would be a good time to talk a little bit about the very first step in designing a guitar amplifier. And that step is actually deciding what power and output transformer you are going to use for your build. Now, there are a couple ways that you can do this. The first way is to just simply find a design that you are, privy to. Maybe you like a JCM 800, maybe you like a Friedman Pink Taco or something like that. And maybe you found the schematic online and you know enough data to pick and choose what parts you need to use for it, right? So obviously it would make sense that you would just use like a JCM 800 power transformer and, whatever X output transformer you need for that type of amp, correct? Right? I mean, that's simple enough. That's kind of the half-ass, dirty way of doing it. It does work that way, obviously. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. But the other way is to actually do some of the math and kind of suss this stuff out. Now, this is helpful in many ways because if you don't actually know and want to do something that's different than what's out on the market, it's a good way to know what option you want to go with, okay? The other reason that it's helpful is it can actually be a way to call bullshit on some of these other builders out there that say, custom wound, output transformer or custom wound power transformer. All that means is that they don't have something that you can get off the shelf. So they change something within the winding in order to change the output voltage, the secondary voltage, or, maybe they got the primary resistance a little bit different or something like that to meet the result that they're looking to do. So let's talk a little bit more about option number 2 and how we can decide what power and what output transformer we want to go with. Let me set this aside. Okay. So, first and foremost, make sure you have your drink of choice in hand or within arm's reach at all times. Today is Red Bull. Yesterday I was enjoying myself some Maker's Mark cask strength. If you're going to be an alcoholic like me, make sure you're a damn good one, all right? And I tell my doctor I can never lie. I only drink on days that end in Y. But don't cue the laugh track. Let's go. All right. So first and foremost, before we do anything, when we're designing a guitar amp, we have to kind of know some design criterion. We need to know where we have to start at, right? So the very first thing that we have to decide is how many watts do we want this amp to be? So let's just say I want an amp that produces between... I'm gonna write all this down. Sorry. Don't you laugh at my handwriting. I just never happened to progress past 3rd grade. That's all there is to it. So I want to design an amp. This is me. I'm talking about me. This is not necessarily you, but we're going to work through all that, all right? So I want an amp that I can get somewhere between 30 watts and 45 watts. That's kind of my range that I'm looking for. So the next thing that we need to know how we're going to do that is to kind of weed through some of the tube options that we have. So on the low end, you could do a quad of EL84s and get 30 watts. You're not going to get 45 watts though. Same for a pair of 6V6s. Obviously, we're trying to shoot for a pair of tubes in this instance because we're not, exceeding 50 watts. So a pair of 6V6s are the same, about 14 watts a piece. You're not going to you might get 30 out of it, but you're not going to get 45. So that makes 6V6s out of the option trail too as well, whatever. So the only other viable options to get you kind of within this range are going to be 5881s, EL34, 6L6s, 6550s, etc., etc. Any of the actual big bottle tubes is going to fit you in that realm. Well, I decided I'm going to go with an EL34 for this particular build. So let's write that down. So now we know what tube we want to use. So we're going to go tubes, and we're going to go EL34. And we have 2 of those. That's important. All right. So now we also have to know how many preamp tubes that we're going to have in this circuit. So I'm using 3 12AX7s. So we'll just put 12AX7. If you're using a different type of tube, obviously you need to look up the spec sheets for that different type of tube. You still need to know how many you're going to use because it's important for the next part of why we wrote that down, which is 3 HT draw. Okay, so when I say HT draw, I'm talking about the anodes of the tubes within the amp. So the anodes draw current, right? So that is the amount of current that the power transformer in the HT rail needs to be able to provide. So we need to know how much we're going to draw in order to know how much high tension current we need to supply. So EL34s draw between about 100 and 120 milliamps per tube. We have 2 of those. I'm going to be pretty conservative because I'm not shooting to actually pull all 25 watts out of each of these guys here. So I'm going to say 100 milliamps per tube. Now, 12AX7s only draw about a milliamp per tube. I have 3 of them, right? So 3 milliamps. Let's just get a little more conservative. Let's roll that up to 6, so we'll double that. And then just for shits and giggles, we'll round it out to the next nearest whole number, which would be 10. So we're going to say we have 210 milliamps worth of current draw on the HT rail in this amp. So I'm going to write that down. And we're going to put MA for milliamp. So we now know that we need a power transformer that will at least provide 210 milliamps of HT current. So next, we need to know what our heater draw is. So I'm going to write that down as well. So we're going to go heater current. All right. Equals. So EL34s are pretty hungry. They like to draw a lot of heater current, and they draw at about 1.5 amps a piece. So we've got 3 amps there just in the power tubes. 12AX7s are a little more conservative. They draw about 300 milliamps each. So 900 milliamps. Let's just round it up to the nearest whole, amp, if you will, which would be 1 amp. So now we've got 3, 4, that's 4 amps worth of heater current that we need to be able to supply for our tubes. So now we know that we need a power transformer that will provide at least 4 amps, preferably more, of heater current. We're kind of done with this page for now. We need to find out some other things because next thing we need to know is what our power transformer voltage will be. So we need to do some math to do that. So just to kind of clarify what we've done so far, we've given ourselves a range, and it doesn't have to be as large as mine is. If you're shooting for 45 or 50 watts, you can put it at 45 or 50 watts. That's totally fine. This is for me. This is my design criterion. You need to pick the tubes that you got or want to use. So we're going to go with EL34s and 12AX7s in the preamp. With that data there, we can find out what our HT draw on our HT rail will be. In this case, it's 210 milliamps, and your heater current as well, which we found out to be 4 amps. So we know that we need a power transformer that will provide better than 210 milliamps of HT current and better than 4 amps of heater current. I would say it's best to go above by about 25% at least. That gives you just a little bit of a safety buffer. It gets more expensive and obviously larger as you go higher with that number there. So if you want something that will, if you want to try to get to 510 milliamps, your transformer is literally going to be the size of your head by the time you're done. So that number there, you want to try to be as conservative as you can be with it. Heater current is a little more important. So don't skinch here. You want to get at least 1 amp over, preferably 2 amps if you can. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So let's set this aside and let's work out our next bit of data that we need to work on. So going to our power tubes here, we're talking about this wattage number here. How the hell do we know how many watts we're going to get out of an amplifier given the specific power transformer and output transformer that we use, right? That's where these guys come in and the voltage that sets on their anode. So that's what we're actually going to write down now is the voltage on anode or plate, if you want to call it the plate, of tube. So we're going to write that down. Equals. Now, you kind of have to have a general idea of what that voltage will be to begin with. Obviously, something like 250 volts is going to be too low. We know that it's going to be too low. Most 50 watt amps, a la JCM 800 or something like that, is going to have somewhere around 500 volts. I'm shooting for a little more conservative. Again, we're not shooting for 50 plus watts. We're shooting for about 30 to 45 watts. So I'm going to go a little bit lower, but we know it's going to be over 400 and likely between 500. So between 400 and 500, so I'm going to put 420. And all you pot smokers out there, I'm sure, are smiling ear to ear right now. So we have decided, for now, this is a hypothetical number at this moment in time, okay? So we don't actually know what it's going to be. We're going to need to do some back and forth with another number that we're just about to pull out of our butts in order to come up with how many watts we're actually going to be able to provide with this particular amp. So the next thing that we need to know is the primary impedance. I'm just going to put imp of the output transformer. So this one, just clarify things here a little bit. This is our PT. And then this one will be our OT. Okay, so primary impedance. There are several options. What I can tell you is that larger bottle tubes, so we're talking 5881s, EL34, 606s, etc., those types of tubes generally want a lower primary impedance. Now, there is a chart that you can find online. I'm not going to show it to you. I'm not going to go over it right now, but the chart kind of has like a duck curve in it, and then it has another like hump type curve in it. And what it is that the little duck type curve is the amount of harmonic distortion, whereas the little hump curve is the amount of output power that you would have. And what you're trying to do is find the lowest harmonic distortion with the greatest amount of output power, and that'll tell you kind of an ideal voltage. So between the voltage that you have, the primary impedance that you have, which is part of that duck curve, you can kind of suss out where you're going to land in terms of harmonic distortion versus the amount of watts that you can put out with that combination. So in this case here, we're going to go with 4K just as a shits and giggles type of number. So we'll put 4K. Excuse me, sorry. So note that that is 4,000 ohms, okay? Ooh, excusez-moi. So what does that mean? Okay, so the way to figure out how many watts you're going to get out of this combination is you take your number, your volts on the anode, 420 is what we're saying, and then you times it by itself, so we square it, so 420, divide it by the primary impedance, so 4,000 ohms, I'm going to put the little omega symbol there, equals what? Let's bust out our calculator here. So 420 times 420. I hope you can see that. I'll make it so you can. So 420 times 420 equals some large number. And then you divide that by 4,000. So 4,123 equals 44.1. So that's how many watts we would be able to provide with this combination right here. So 420 volts on the anode of our tube with a 4K output transformer for the primary impedance should net us about 44 watts of power. Now, what if you want, so that's obviously within our design criterion here. So we were shooting 30 to 45. We're right on the mark there. What if we want to go the other way though? So let's say that we're trying to actually lower that down. We want to get closer to 30 watts. Well, let's imagine, I'm going to put a pipe there, and we're going to go 6.6K. So this output transformer that I have here is actually a 6.6K. If you're using a JTM 45 transformer, it might be 7K or something like that. So what is it going to be if we use that 6.6K output transformer? So same, you take the 420 and you times it by itself, so you square it, and you divide that by 6,600 equals what? What is that going to equal? So you take your 420 times 420 equals some large number, divide that by 6,600, and you get 26.72. It's going to be close to 27 watts. 3 watts isn't going to make or break this amp. I kind of feel like it'd make a little more than that actually anyway. So we're within our design criterion with those two numbers right there. So obviously, if we wanted to increase the amount of output wattage for this 6,600 ohm primary impedance, we would just go with a higher voltage on the anode, right? So let's do a hypothetical on that. Let's just say we have 455 volts. So you go 455 times 455 equals some large number. Divide that by 6,600. And you can see here that we've now breached 31.36. So if we had 455 volts on the anode of our EL34s, we should be able to net closer to 32 watts. So you can kind of see how you can play with these numbers here a little bit. Now, I happen to have not a 4K output transformer. I have a 3.8K output transformer available to me if this 6.6K does not float my boat. So what does that look like, considering I know that I'm shooting for about 420 volts on my anode? Well, same. You take 420 times 420 equals some large number, and divide that by 3,800 equals 46.42 watts. So I would land within a watt of my design criterion with that option. So that's how you can kind of play with these two numbers. Once you have solidified what those two numbers are, you can now actually start to hone in or dial in what type of power transformer you're going to use. So now we get to start working on our power transformer specs. So I'm going to go PT specs. So we've kind of already weeded out at this point what our primary transformer specs are going to be. If we want a 4.8 16 ohm output secondary, then and a 4K primary, we already know then what our what options that we're shooting for our output transformer. So our power transformer specs are going to be, well, that number doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot to us right now, right? 420 volts. How are we getting that 420 volts? So we kind of need to go backwards a little further. We need to know how our rectifier is going to produce that amount of voltage. So let's write down rectifier. Okay, so a rectifier takes, I'm going to draw here, so don't laugh, okay? All right, so you get a sine wave out. This is 0 volts here, 0 volts. And then over here, you're going to have some positive number and some negative number. And then it gets rectified. So the rectifier will take this here and move it up. So this is going to be plus, this is going to be minus, and then it's going to flip-flop that up. And what you're going to get on the other side is something that looks like this, right? So that's what you end up with on the other side. And of course, you just get a plus, and then this is our 0 volt reference. So that's what the rectifier does. So how do we know how much more voltage we're going to get added when we take this 60 hertz signal here and turn it into 120 hertz here, right? Because we do get a voltage addition when we do this. What is that amount of voltage addition? Well, what you do is you take some arbitrary number, if you will, and you times it by 1.4. So let's just pull some arbitrary number out of our butt. We're going to say a 300, 0, 300. 300-0-300. This is volts, 0 volts, 300 volts, is equal to 600 VCT. Now, VCT is volts to center tap. So if you see a power transformer spec that says 300, 0, 300, you know that it is a 600 VCT power transformer. If you see one that doesn't have 300, 0, 300, if it doesn't state those facts there, whatever this is, if you split it in half, that's what it will be. So if you have a 700 volt VCT, so 700 VCT, you would know that you have 350, 0, 350. Okay, now not all power transformers have a center tap, so you want to know if you're gonna what type of rectification you're gonna go with at this point. If you're gonna go with a tube rectifier like I am pretty much you want to make sure that you have a center tap. I prefer having a center tap in all cases. Now, if you don't have a center tap for your output for your power transformer secondary, you're going to have to use a full wave bridge rectifier. Totally fine, that is fine. This does not produce a full wave bridge rectifier. Full wave bridge rectifier. Sorry, my best electro boom. This one here, it's full wave rectification. Same, just a different way of getting there, okay? So, now we know that we've got plus 300 volts here on this side. That's what we're assuming anyway. And we got minus 300 over here. What does that mean? So we take that 300 volts. So we take 1/2 of the secondary, and then you times that by 1.4. And that equals what? Let's find out. So 300 times 1.4 equals 420. Such a random number I pulled out, right? So 420. So now you can kind of get an idea here of what you're shooting for. So let's go a little more extreme. Let's say we're going to have 325, 0, 325, right? So that would be a 600 VCT power transformer. So let's do that now. So you take 325 times that by 1.4, and you get 455. So that's the rough amount of volts that you would get there. Now, this should be the loaded down voltage. That's how most of these power transformers are rated for, is that the voltage that they will provide is after it's loaded down with all this stuff. Now, things can change depending on the type of rectifier tube you have and the amount of current draw on it. So a GZ34 has about the least amount of voltage loss. So I might be 410 volts and I might be even higher still. We don't know yet exactly. So this is not a hard, fast number. It is a rough number. Close enough to get you within a ballpark. Now, do also be mindful that on your power transformer, you have multiple taps. So you usually have this one here tells you what it's got. So this one has a 120 volt tap and a 110 volt tap. So if I need to up the voltage out of my power transformer a little bit, if I connect to the 110 volt tap, I can get a little bit higher voltage out of it. Now, that's also going to bring the heater voltage up, so you do need to be mindful that you're playing on a slippery slope. But if you know that your country or region has a slightly lower voltage on any given day of the month or week or day or whatever, you can play with that a little bit. So some areas, don't generally breach 120 volts. They're always, 110 to 115 or something. So going on the 110 volt tap will ensure that you get the full beans out of that thing. Conversely, if you're in an area that you know that on any given day of the week, you're going to see 122 volts or something like that. There are some places that have 124 or 125 volts. You're going to want to make sure that you use the 125 or 120 volt tap. So that's all that means. So let's do another hypothetical. Let's say we're really going for gusto here. So we want a 700 volt center tap, right? Let's just say we're going big. So that would be 350, 0, 350, right? So let's go 350 times 1.4. As you see here, that we'd end up with about 490 volts here. So if you have 490 volts times 490 volts, it gives you some large number, and then you divide that by 4,000. You're going to see here how we can get into trouble really quick. So at 60 watts, we have now breached the capability of these tubes. It's probably not a wise idea to use 490 volts on the anode of these tubes here with the 4K primary impedance. You can draw up to 60 watts through these guys, so that'll burn them up quite quickly, which means that going to 6L6s probably wouldn't be so bad if you had 490 volts with a 4K primary impedance. Now, what I can tell you is by the time you get about 490 volts on the anode of most tubes, you're probably going to be shooting for something a little bit higher than 4K. You're probably going to be getting somewhere closer to 5 or 6K. 1K either way is not going to make or break things, but let's do the same thing again. So times 490 equals some large number. Get out of here, prime. And then we're going to divide that by 6.6K, and we're just going to say that that's the one we want. So now we're at 36 watts, right? So now we know that we could get 36 watts, which is something doable with this here if we had a higher voltage. on the anode of these tubes. So the EL34s, you can kind of see what I was trying to shoot for with what I was working with here. That's why that primary impedance is important. So with all of this data here, and here I'm going to put plus 300 here as well. So now we know how we can come up to this number here. So you just take half the center tap, or half the primary or secondary, excuse me, of your power transformer secondary, times it by 1.4, and you have a rough idea of what you're going to get. Again, depending on the type of rectifier you use, will vary that number a little bit. If you go with a 5U4, that obviously will draw the voltage down a little bit more, and you might get less voltage out. Just depends. This just gets you kind of in the ballpark. So now we know exactly what type of transformer, excuse me, sorry, I'm burpy right now, that we're looking to get. So let me take a sippy sip. Okay, so now we know what our power transformer needs to be. My apologies, I'm pulling my shit together right now. All right, so we know that our PT needs to be 300, 0, 300, and we're gonna call it, I'm gonna put a long line there, so 600 VCT. What do you know? I just happen to have one of these laying around right here. This big bad mamma jamma. Now, I mentioned before that as you get higher on this value here, this guy gets larger, given the same volts. So if you needed 200 or 300 milliamps worth of current out of this thing here, this guy would start growing exponentially. It almost gets to a point where it gets too big. So you got to be semi-conservative with what you're trying to do. So you got to be mindful of that. This guy here is pretty beefy. So we're about to see why a little bit more. So I need 210 milliamps of current draw. I'm probably not going to pull quite that much, but this one will produce 250 milliamps with a 600 VCT. And you'll notice it doesn't say 300, 0, 300. So that's how you know how to do this, is with what I just taught you right now. So now this one has 2 taps on it for heaters. One of the taps is for a rectifier tube. So you do need to be aware of what's going on there. If you have a 5-volt center tap, or you have a 5-volt rectifier, you need to know how much current that thing's going to draw. In this case here, 4 amps will take care of just about all rectifier tubes. And then of course we got our green side of things, which is our heater side of things, which is for our EL34s, 12AX7s, etc., etc. We have 8 amps worth of current on this guy. We are double the capacity of the heater current that we need to be able to provide. I would shoot for more like 6 amps if I could do it. Now, if I were doing a custom wound primary, power transformer, that's what you would do, is say, hey, can I have this exact transformer made, but can you make it so it only needs, so it only is rated for 6 amps instead? All of a sudden you've got a custom wound transformer. You can kind of see why it's ideal to try to find parts that are off the shelf though. Most all the parts that are off the shelf are made because they fit 99.99% of the stuff that's out there. If you really just need it to be to within a gnat's ass, then by all means go and order a custom transformer. There are some that do that. So now let's get into the output transformer side of things. So let's go ahead and write that down. I'm gonna set it aside real quick. So we know that our output transformer is going to equal something between 4K to 6.6K. And I say that because that's the range that I have, and it needs to be rated for X watts. So not X, but at X watts. So what that means is that you need a 4K output transformer that is rated for 30 to 45 watts. Okay. So now we know how we're going to build this amplifier. There you have it. That is how you start the design of your guitar amplifier. So this will get you your power supply figured out. This will get you what output transformer you need to buy. So then you can buy those 2 parts. You can buy these parts here before you even start drilling any holes in your chassis. You need to know what these are going to be. So I hope this answers some questions. There are some design criterions that will determine the output transformer that you want to use. What I can tell you is that when you go larger in primary impedance, especially with the big bottle tubes, it does change the sound. It does change the feel. Without going too deep into it, it induces distortion, so it causes the output section to break up a little sooner when you go with higher primary impedance. It also, of course, lowers the output wattage, but it does kind of make the tubes work a little bit differently as well. So it can induce like a more third order harmonics, or odd order harmonics, I guess I could say. So when you go the other way, so when you go lower, you obviously get more output power, so you get more wattage. You get more headroom as well, so it'll stay cleaner longer when you go with lower values. But because it's a little more efficient, you don't get as many as much harmonic buildup, at least, with the lower primary impedance. Now that might be what you're looking for. It might not be what you're looking for. What I find tends to be more apparent with it, sound wise, it does with the larger primary impedance, it does kind of broaden. I should do it the other way. It does kind of broaden the frequency response. So you get a little bit more lows and you get a little more highs, and you probably get a little bit more of that because there's more harmonic distortion. That extra harmonic content kind of broadens out the frequency response a little bit. And it does feel a little bit different. It's chewier. It has more, it's almost like a glue, if you will, under the note, which I like. I go for feel when I'm playing with an amp. So when it's cranked to the 211, I want it to feel a certain way. Generally with the lower primary impedance, it'll be a little bit sharper attack. It's not as chewy under the fingers. It's a little more abrupt, if you will, whereas going with the higher impedance, it tends to chew it up a little bit, make it a little, it just has a different feel. Now, that's not always the case. There's all kinds of different variables that come into play, but in general, that's kind of what you're going to get. There is kind of a window, though. You can't go too crazy. Like, obviously going with 8K to 10K is probably not advisable when you're going with the larger bottle glass. Whereas going too low is also can be problematic. Now, what I can tell you that is going to be a factor is, let's say you're trying to design a 100-watt amp, and we have, we change that to 100 watts, whatever. When you double the number of the tubes, so if you go from 2 to 4 tubes, these numbers will basically just chop in half. So let's kind of go with, let's start the other direction. We'll go with 1 tube. So if you were doing a single-ended Class A amp, and let's just say this was the ideal number for the tube that you're using with a pair of them, well, this would just turn into 8K for a single tube. So if we were only going to go with 1 EL34, we would go with 8K. With 2, we go with 4K. And with 4 of them, we would go with 2K, right? Same the other way. If we wanted to start at 6K right there, if we had 1, we would go with 12K. If we had 2, we go with 6.6. And with 4, we would go with 3.3, right? You just kind of cut it in half either direction. However, what I can tell you is that you're not often going to find a 2K primary impedance output transformer. You're generally going to find something closer to 3K. So again, there's these variables. So you're trying to find something that's off the shelf and kind of can do what you're looking to do. But in either case, I hope this answers some questions. I thank you for sticking with me this long if you have, and well, we'll just see you in the next one.